Okay, so let's move now from the Afghanosphere to the Turcosphere here. So there was a well-known Turkish Afghan poet and sort of academic and teacher named Ergesh Uchkun, who was active with the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan. He was very prominent in the 80s. And I know this because I worked directly with his son, Ibars. And Ergesh Uchkun very strongly believed in a genetic link between the Turks and the Native Americans. What would you say to that? Is there any linguistic, biological, genetic evidence for that?
I'll deal with the linguistics because there's a lot of change that I think needs to happen. And then go back to the genetics because there's some really exciting data there. In terms of linguistics, let me back up and give a big picture as to why. So I guess the short answer is no. At face value right now, there are not linguistic links between Asia and the Americas. But here's the bigger picture. I think the linguistic data are ripe for reanalysis. So I'm going to approach this from a biblical perspective, but I think there's a good case to be made here. My position on Genesis 10 and 11, thinking again about the globe and how languages relate to all this. You have one language, one speech, Genesis 11 verse 1, which makes sense because this is right after the flood. Noah and his family have stepped off the ark, and it's family. So of course they're going to be speaking one language. There's no need for additional languages. They're all related. God commands them to spread out, fill the earth. They say, nope, we're going to build a tower, a city. We're going to make a name for ourselves. We're going to stay right here. So God confuses their languages to force them to spread out. And I think Genesis 10, one chapter prior, lists the names of the heads of the initial ethno-linguistic groups. There's still questions I have about Genesis 10 because I'm told some of those names are singular nouns, some of those names are plural nouns, some of those names are adjectives. I don't know why that exists, but my working model for Genesis 10 is it's about 70 names, and those 70 about the initial ethno-linguistic groups. After Babel, there's a lot of additional language diversification that happens so that we now have over 7,000 languages in the world today. But what's interesting to me is if you look at the language families, groupings. So I think I alluded to these earlier. English that we're speaking right now is part of the Indo-European language family. My mother's German. I grew up speaking German, and I can see some of the concept of a language family because I remember we were in Germany one time watching a Norwegian wedding. They were speaking Norwegian, and if I listened really hard, I almost could understand what they're saying. We've been in the Netherlands. Of course, they speak Dutch. And again, you can almost, as a German speaker, understand what they're saying. There's similarities that hint at common ancestry. So English is part of the Germanic subgroup of Indo-European. Anyway, there's language families. The total number of language families in the globe today is about 150. That's not 70, but that's a whole lot closer to 70 than 7,000 is. What's even more interesting is the majority of language families in the globe today are found in the Americas. So I think there's been an overclassification of Native American language families. They're an outlier in a sense. So is Papua New Guinea, or that region of Melanesia, where there's an abundance of language families compared to the geographic area. So I'm no linguist by training, but I would love to see a linguist kind of grab the bull by the horns and see if there are indeed linguistic links between. So first of all, are there more linguistic links? Can we reduce the number of language families in the Americas? Can we find more connections among these diverse peoples than is currently accepted? And then once that's done, might there also be links into Asia that we didn't notice before? So to summarize then, no, there are not currently recognized linguistic links between Turks or Central Asia and the Americas, but I suspect there will be some discovered in the future because of this odd statistical outlier that the American languages represent. Secondly, in terms of genetics, there are very clear genetic links between Central Asia and the Americas. In the evolutionary timescale, again, they, in a sense, are forced to punt that date, that link, into the incomprehensibly distant past, 15,000 years ago. When you reanalyze these data basically from the ground up, which happens to confirm the biblical worldview, you find that there was a migration from Central Asia into the Americas about the 400s AD, and this very specifically links you to Central Asia. One of the main branches or haplogroups in the Americas is this haplogroup Q, again, just an arbitrary letter of the alphabet. I think about 60% of the Turkmens in Turkmenistan belong to the same branch. So there's most definitely links there, and I can say specifically that the Native American migration from Asia into the Americas around that time was clearly linked to the Hunnic, the migration of the Huns into Europe at the time of the fall of the Roman Empire. There's another migration from Central Asia into the Americas about the 900s AD, and this is another time. Actually, this is really interesting because this gives you a much more direct link to the Turkic peoples, because this was the time of the. So Magyars are not Turkic peoples, but they were Central Asians, ancestors of the Hungarians that came into Europe about this time. But there's Kipchaks and others who are part of the Turkic language family who move from Central Asia towards Eastern Europe. They actually end up being ancestors of the majority of Western and Eastern Europeans today. And that's the exact same time when there's another migration from that region, roughly, into the Americas. And I even though they're not necessarily the same branches on the family tree, they come from the same region. And so there's abundant evidence to link Turkic peoples from Central Asia to the Native Americans. In terms of genetics, we have additional migrations I've discovered with mitochondrial DNA, but these seem to be a little bit more linked to Eastern Asia, and I don't yet have the full picture for Central Asia. But that statement and that supposition of there being links between Turkic peoples and Native Americans is most definitely confirmed by genetics.
Okay, so first of all, if you need like Turkmen DNA, I have like so many Turkmens I can introduce you to. It's ridiculous. One of our board members is kind of like one of the founding fathers of the church in Turkmenistan. He's great. Obviously, the idea of having like large migrations from Asia to America in like 400 and 900 AD, like seems insane to the sort of secular academy and everything we think about the past. Putting aside how like jarring that feels and how intriguing that is, I'm actually this is my own question here, because I've been like obsessively looking into this since watching your videos and reading your books. So what I'm most interested in here is, what you're charting is the red record, which some people find dubious, but you're supplementing that with a lot of other Native American oral history, pointing back to this, like it's kind of starts in Alaska, then moves down from east to west. What I'm actually really curious about is where the heck do these people disappear from in Central Asia? And I know that's difficult because we don't even really know where the Huns come from themselves, but it seems kind of... So I'm curious if there's a way we can kind of like link these people leaving Central Asia to getting to the Americas. Like, who were they before they crossed?
Yes, that's a good question. And let me think of the Y chromosome data, and then I can think in terms of the recent mitochondrial data. And I think all of this answers actually a number of questions. You're mentioning the shock this is for the mainstream community. I think part of what alleviates the shock is it makes sense in terms of what we know about historical migrations and movements of peoples. And just as a general statement, I think it's helpful to, and it's something I remind myself of all the time, Central Asia not being as conducive to agriculture is conducive to pastoral ways of life. Pastoral ways of life naturally keep you on the move and force you to be adaptable. And that has played out in a very strong way in the Americas, where the descendants of the Central Asians who came over have thrived from the Arctic to the Amazon. Dramatically different environments, but they've adapted and survived and thrived very well. So that, I think, speaks in a sense to the Central Asian past, and it really was actually initially going to try to make a point here about is Central Asia has a long history of being on the move, and so trying to figure out who they came from is a little bit like trying to hit a moving target, almost literally, because they're constantly on the move. Again, I think because of this environment in which they find themselves, it's a pastoral environment, and so that kind of puts people on the move. With regards to the 400s migration in AD, I say it's that link from the Americas to Central Asia is directly to the Huns, because we have in Europe the same branch at the same time at a very low level. The Huns weren't here in Europe there that long, so it kind of fits, I think. But I can find the genetic echo in Europe of the Huns being there, and it branches off, same branch with the Native Americans, the one that became the Native Americans, over in the Americas. So there I think we've got fairly clear genetic linkages we can establish. We should, in theory, be able to do the same thing with the 900s migration. It is from a branch that, in terms of the overall branch, not the specific sub-branch that it branches off, because I don't have enough detail yet, but it's haplogroup C. C is very strongly Mongolian today, and it may have something to do with the peoples that were up there at that time. I can't narrow it down quite yet. And let me pause that story for a moment to bring in some of the mitochondrial data, because I think, again, in terms of general movements and politics, there are clues even before I get the final answer. So the reason I'm hesitating on that 900s migration is because there isn't much published full Y chromosome sequence data on that migration. From what we do have, I've been able to make these inferences, but to nail down specifically who was it, there just isn't enough data out there yet to say so, but I think we can in the near future once it comes out. Politics and other things I think are helpful clues. So just to back up a minute, it was interesting to me that the dominant lineage in the Americas stems from this migration about the 400s, even before I was able to directly link genetically to the Huns. I noticed that this is a period for Central Asia called the Völkerwanderung, the German word for the great wandering of peoples. It's already known there's something brewing, stirring in Central Asia, because the Huns just happened to be going into Europe at that time. The Xianbai and others are going the other direction into Asia. There's people have talked about, I think, about environmental factors or climate change, but that seems to be the favorite fallback for everyone these days, so I tend to be skeptical. Anyway, something's going on, that there's a lot of movement. I'm like, well, is it any surprise then that someone would also just keep going east and finally end up in the Americas? Similar thing then, I think, for the nine. So my point is, we've been able to confirm that genetically, link it to the Huns, but it was preceded by a curious correlation between known historical migrations and then one that ends up in the Americas. Again, for the Middle Ages, the 900s AD or so, we've got known documented migrations, specifically of Turkic peoples, into Europe. I don't know that I know the reason why. These are not necessarily things I grew up learning, but I had to learn after the fact, but they're in the books. And I've got very clear, for Europe, genetic linkages and connections to those known historical migrations, Kipchaks and others. And so is it any surprise then that the people would go the other direction into the Americas? And I'm forgetting the Chinese history that might correlate with this. So let me add in two more other migrations I just discovered this year. After the They Had Names book came out, I published a paper in July. They Had Names came out in May. There's a migration that happened, and I can detect this again with the female inherited mitochondrial DNA, about the 100s BC into the Americas. And I can tie it to interesting events that happened over here, archaeologically. The great city of Teotihuacan in Mexico began its sudden growth, basically, right about that time. Well, the lineage genetically takes me back to Northeast Asia. And what's interesting to me is that the centuries preceding that were characterized by the dominance of the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu were among the more famous sort of northern barbarians, might have some sort of Central Asian linkage as well. The northern groups who would harass the Chinese, and one of the reasons they were needing to build a great wall to keep them out, well, they were successful, and the 100s BC is when the Chinese finally began to push them back out. And my impression is, when you ask the question, why would people want to go to the Americas, I think there's sort of this general pattern of there's a crisis, whether it's agricultural, pastoral, some sort of cultural crisis, because we can't feed ourselves, we have to go find food elsewhere, or political crisis, which I think fits this case, where the Xianbai lose, well, where are we going to go? Well, we heard there's empty lands over there, or whatever it is. It's plausible to me, so I think we can make a connection there, and I feel we can make a strong case that it's specifically the Xiongnu that are the ancestors of, in the Americas, Teotihuacan. Anyway, there's really interesting correlations that pop up here. Then there's another migration of 1000 BC, which, in terms of East Asia, it's very early. That's the transition from the Shang dynasty to the Zhou dynasty, and there isn't a lot. It's still in the period where you don't have a ton of information for Chinese history, let alone Northeast Asian, Central Asian history. But genetically, there is a migration out of that region. I can see this with the Y chromosome. Out of that region, down through Japan, through the Philippines, across the coast of New Guinea, into the Pacific. Ultimately, it gives rise to the Polynesians over several thousand years. But there is a migration genetically. I can tie that to as well. So anyway, my point is there's a lot of correlations with other genetic events, with historical political events, with cultural upheaval, and this is a new place. I didn't have a lot of these answers just even 5 years ago because I scratched my head, what can I tie this to? But the answers have emerged to me in a very exciting and satisfying way over time, and I think we can make a very strong case, and I think it'll only get stronger with very specific peoples. They came from this group. I think we should be able to say in the next few years.
Okay, so I suppose a couple points on this is that, like, people might ask, well, how is this chapter deleted from North Central Asian history? But there is no North Central Asian history to be deleted from in the first place. Like, I was looking into the linguistic ties, myself, and there are some words, but people chalk those up to coincidence, right? So the word kayak, for example, is small boat in Turkish and Native American language. People, it's not a big enough, you can have some duplicate words with unlinked languages. But there's no trace, for example, of the Hunnic language in the first place. There's no record of it because there's no writing system. And I guess the other thing that I found is that there have been trade links between Alaska and Siberia since they've never stopped. As far as I can tell, right? It seems like there has been links between Inuit communities in Siberia and Alaska. So there's no point. There's absolutely unbroken contact between America and Asia in human history. So if hypothetically, you have 10,000 of a sort of Hunnic group, which is trying to get away from the more violent Hunnic group or something, and and they're like, all right, where can we go? So, well, I know a guy. He talks about this, continent he visits for trade, and they just pay a guy to. This is entirely plausible that people from Central Asia could get to America if they knew the right person, because the right person did exist all throughout human history. So essentially, it simplifies it a bit, but it seems like it makes sense of some of the data, because you've got, early on in the Americas, you have these sort of city-building, sedentary cultures, which kind of seem to give way to these later nomadic cultures which arise. There's almost two really clear waves of culture there, but you're saying there's far more than that, plausibly.
Based on genetics, there were at least 5 migrations from the Old World into the New before Columbus in 1492. It was a very dynamic place, regular links between the two. It raises the question, of course, did Native Americans go back? I don't know the answer yet, but that's, I think, something we can put on the table as a matter of further exploration.
Okay, well, so again, so anybody who's watching this and wants to kind of explore, run with this, dig deeper, explore the history here, how is the best way for them to do that? Where can they find your work, and how could they actually get involved in your work?
Yeah, so the sort of the one-stop place to get the history of North America before Columbus, as we currently understand it, is this new book, They Had Names, Tracing the History of the North American Indigenous People, which just came out in May. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it on I work for Answers in Genesis. We have a web store. There's other places that the publisher, New Leaf Publishing Group, sells it. There's a map that goes with it too. You can download it. You can contact me directly through answersingenesis.org/go/they had names. That has that big map of North America at contact. Plus, if you scroll down, you can find a way to enter name, email, goes directly to my inbox. I've contacted people that way. There's a YouTube channel that Answers in Genesis has. If you go to, I think it's at Answers in Genesis or something on YouTube. I've got several playlists that deal with this history. We did a whole playlist on Traced, so the global DNA history back in 2022. We've got a couple playlists now, one that's ongoing, one on the lost history of North America that was kind of the prelude to the book, and I'm doing a series on They Had Names that kind of gives the history chapter by chapter for the book, or multiple chapters together. So there's lots of outlets to find more information. It is ongoing research. I'm currently in the throes of trying to figure out Central American history. Like I said, I just made a discovery this year on mitochondrial DNA. That's something on our website you can keep up with. I am on social media like Facebook, Twitter. I think we got in touch, or X now is what it is. We got in touch that way, and I try to keep people abreast of things, discoveries as they happen. A way to contact people directly, but also to just broadcast when discoveries are made, or hey, we need help with this part of the project, or hey, if you know someone who's involved in this, could you have them contact me, that sort of thing. So lots of ways to keep up to speed, or to surface level, dive deep, whatever someone wants to do to explore this topic.